World War II labor shortages helped some ethnic minorities. The war had the opposite effect for people of Japanese descent. Before and during World War II, people of Japanese descent were primarily farmers, since they were ethnic minorities. After Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 Americans, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan. It took fewer than 3 months for Roosevelt to stretch the contours of enemy beyond the bounds of nationality or even citizenship to include a whole race. Within a few months, the Roosevelt administration had created the War Relocation Authority, charged with rounding up and interning all people of Japanese descent on the West Coast. At least 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, more than two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens, were incarcerated in military camps based exclusively on their ethnicity, in violation of their constitutional rights. It's telling that German and Italian Americans weren't rounded up en masse, despite the fact that Germany and Italy were also America's enemies during World War II. During the less than 13 years of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership of the modern American civil rights movement, from December 1955 until April 4, 1968, African Americans achieved more genuine progress toward racial equality in America than the previous 350 years had produced. Dr. King is widely regarded as America's preeminent advocate of nonviolence and one of the greatest nonviolent leaders in world history. Drawing inspiration from both his Christian faith and the peaceful teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. King led the nonviolent movement in the late 1950s and 1960s to achieve legal equality for African Americans in the United States, while others were advocating for freedom by any means necessary, including violence. Martin Luther King Jr. used the power of words and acts of nonviolence resistance such as protest, grassroots organizing, and civil disobedience to achieve seemingly impossible goals. He went on to lead similar campaigns against poverty and international conflict, always maintaining fidelity to his principles that men and women everywhere, regardless of color or creed, are equal members of the human family. Dr. King did not preach color blindness or neutrality. His activism was considered radical and dangerous by many, from U.S. government to members of the clergy. He not only campaigned against racism, but also for economic equality. His messages are often reduced to encouragements to, quote, not see race, or to push for civility in political discourse. If you closely read his word, you will see that King urged all citizens to disrupt oppressive structures, no matter how uncomfortable it is. The core mission of the civil rights movement was a demand for equity, justice, and respectful treatment of people of all identities. The legacies of historical events remain. Examining the goals and the tactics of the civil rights movement, the same issues related to race, class, gender, ability, health, and other identities are still present today.
Affirmative action began as riot control. Harlem was up in flames. Bed-Stuy was up in flames. Newark was up in flames. And if we don't do something to bring in young black people to the mainstream economically and educationally, we're not sure the society will hold together. The words affirmative action initially were attempts to deal with discrimination that African Americans faced in the labor market. There were executive orders by President Kennedy and President Johnson which said employers had to make a good faith effort to use affirmative action in their hiring and recruitment policies, which meant they were going to try to recruit people who had once been discriminated against.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
After the assassination of Dr. King, there were riots in 60 American cities simultaneously. The leaders of the society, whether they were in government, business, or academia, said, this society can't hold together if black people are burning the cities. And they're burning the cities because they feel excluded. So we've got to bring them into our workplace. We got to bring them into our educational institutions. We got to let them feel that they have a stake in the society. It was a very effective response to urban unrest. Hundreds of thousands of people being hired by major corporations who wouldn't have been hired. You had colleges admitting large numbers of black students who previously only admitted a handful. It really changed the country. But it wasn't done because of a sudden burst of conscience. It was done out of fear that the society was falling apart. And when the fear passed, the sense of urgency about recruiting those large numbers of people started to dissipate as well.
So during the 60s and the 70s, there were many federal laws passed to protect groups from discrimination. These are some of the key laws you should be familiar with. In the 60s and 70s, after affirmative action and many anti-discrimination laws were passed, HR training focused on avoiding lawsuits. Hiring took a view of filling a quota of women and minorities. This created problems for everyone. If an individual was promoted only because of gender or race and not qualifications, it set them up for failure. When an individual was hired or promoted based on qualifications, there was an expectation of assimilation. In other words, everyone should blend in and minimize differences. Basically, there was an expectation to behave, dress, and talk like white men. These circumstances led to poor morale, job turnover, and backlash against groups the legislation was designed to benefit. In the 80s and 90s, most organizations approached valuing diversity very superficially. There were ethnic food days as well as training that emphasized differences and generalized stereotypes. In 1987, a landmark study on the workforce made a significant difference in how organizations viewed diversity in the workplace. The study showed changing demographics of the workforce, including the increase of women and minorities working, as well as changes due to globalization. Another landmark study influencing how companies viewed diversity was published in 1991 by Cox and Blake. It showed diversity as a potential competitive advantage and at the same time recognized the difficulty of change initiatives. And a 1996 study by the Hudson Institute analyzed population trends and showed the growth of non-whites, women, and older minorities in the workforce, as well as the expansion of global business. The study argued for the need to understand diverse perspectives and recognize the problem with generalizations, stereotypes, and that people hold multiple group identities. In 1996, Marilyn Loden's framework recognized secondary dimensions of diversity. This broadens people's ideas about diversity, was more inclusive of white men, and created awareness that people have multiple dimensions of diversity impacting their experiences.